Tourette's podcast is not a medical advice show. It's a show about experiences. In the course of that, we may talk about medications or therapies or stories from the doctor's office, but don't mistake any of that for medical advice or direction. It's not. Get that only from people or places licensed or certified to give it. Not from a massively fun and action-packed podcast about our life experiences. Such as?
I would clench my toes in my shoes to the point that I ripped through the soles of the shoes down into the rubber soles, and then it would separate. So I went through 3 pairs of shoes in 6 months.
This is Tourette's podcast, made possible with support of the Tourette Association of America and part of the Geeks Rising Network. Highlights since the last episode. Number 1, flying across the country from LA to New York on a plane with David Lynch, an American treasure and one of the greatest directors in history. I was boarding a plane after a panic attack of sorts. And to my wife, Ambrose, thank you, I love you. Always do a good job restoring me. But yeah, kind of a panic attack in the airport related to unsteady travel plans. And just things not going as they should, and then just the tension of being in an airport in general. And so I'm getting on my JetBlue plane, and there in first class, already seated, was who you might say is the most appropriate person I could have laid eyes on in a situation like that, feeling anxious and wanting to feel better. David Lynch, no doubt about it, sitting right there. And I had a choice to make. Do I go up to him and do the fan meeting the celebrity thing and say, "Hey Dave, I just wanted to say I'm a longtime fan, and by the way, I grew up in the same town where you filmed Blue Velvet, and also my wife lived in the apartment building you filmed some of that movie in. Do you have any memories of that?" You know, do I say that? Do I tell him that? But all this is going through my mind while the people in the aisle ahead of me are stuffing the luggage in the overhead bins, and as this is happening and I'm thinking, I'm making subtle eye contact with David Lynch, and I'm inching forward down the aisle as people are taking their seats, and then all of a sudden I'm right next to him. I'm standing right next to his seat, like 2 feet from him. And I'm still kind of nervous about the airport panic I was feeling earlier, doing all the hypothetical stuff in my head, and I'm ticking. It's making me tick, and my vocal tics are going. And David Lynch, I see him in my peripheral vision. He's noticing my tics. So David Lynch has picked up on something about me. I mean, I think. It looked like it. Maybe the most inconsequential thing that's ever happened to anybody. And certainly Lynch, but, you know, one of the greatest film directors of all time is right there, and he knows something about me. So, like, if I introduce myself to him, and I feel like he knows I'm going to, I can at least tell that he knows that I at least know who he is. I think I said that right. And he's not closing himself off to me. You know, he's not shutting his eyes or anything like that, pretending to be asleep or anything like that. He's still tuned in, but I know who he is. I'm not sure that getting him to know me for 4 seconds ahead of a long cross-country flight is going to necessarily improve the quality of his life that much. And sometimes, you know, we all just kind of need a break. And here's an American treasure just sitting there totally available to me if I wanted to at least, you know, say something. Well, I decided against. I'd probably make no sense, and I don't think I could stomach the thought of David Lynch hearing me talk and not being able to process whatever the heck I'm talking about. And so my first highlight this week is mustering up the reality I needed to make the decision to not bother this man. At this point, I have more direct power than anyone in the world to make David Lynch react right now. And I'm just going to take my seat. That felt really good. Highlight 2, relevant. Getting all up in the face of another celebrity, Ed Norton, one of the great actors of our time, but this time I had a purpose, I had a role. This was an assignment. My wife, Ambrose, and I had to capture the personality and words of Ed Norton, personally introducing his new film, Motherless Brooklyn, to a theater filled with people who have Tourette Syndrome. This is a big deal. It was a big event. It was put on by the Tourette Association with Warner Brothers, I believe. So a whole theater filled with people who have Tourette Syndrome. And at the front of the theater is Ed Norton introducing his film, in which he plays a character who has TS. And by the way, one of the people there was Emily Womack, who, if you remember in the news, she's the teenager who was ticking in a movie theater and people started complaining and management came over and she had to leave. So, I mean, that sucked. But it's pretty cool that she got to watch a pre-release screening of the new Ed Norton movie with Ed Norton in a whole theater filled with people who have Tourette. It was also really nice talking with her and her mom. So the movie, Motherless Brooklyn, it's based on a book by Jonathan Lethem. Norton plays the central character. His name is Lionel, and he's a private investigator who has Tourette syndrome. So thanks to the Tourette Association, I got to be there with this really wonderful group of Touretters and supporters so I could, for one, capture the happenings for the podcast, and two, to put together a video of the occasion with testimonials from Touretters and some words from Tourette Association of America President Amanda Talty and from Norton himself. And I'll go ahead and play you a little chunk of what he had to say. And these are excerpts from his remarks, edited as such. Just wanted to point that out.
Hey, you guys. I was thinking about what I wanted to say, and because this is a special screening. It's a special group, and when I read this book, what Jonathan Lethem captures is empathy. You know, he immediately creates empathy, and I think if there was anything that I wanted to sustain, we did a lot in this that's very different from the book. But if there was anything that I wanted to sustain from the book, it was that I wanted the audience to have the same kind of immediate connection with Lionel and the sensation of empathy and understanding of his complexity that the book achieves. What's interesting is that that radiated outward into the movie at large as we made it a bigger film, not just a character portrait, but a portrait of what happens to a whole city if people are being cruel to it, if people are not taking care of each other. And, you know, I realized that in many ways I wanted to extend that message out across the whole film. I think that when it comes to Lionel and his Tourette's, I think that it's funny, but I always felt that there was a great philosopher of storytelling, Joseph Campbell, who wrote The Power of Myth and things. He says that stories work the best when they're transparent, when you can see through the story to see how it's really about you. And the irony is that I think some people say, well, Lionel and his Tourette syndrome represents something extreme or something extremely unique or unusual, that there's an otherness to him or that it creates an isolation. But the truth is, I think the opposite. I think the reason Lionel is a great character is that everybody doesn't have Tourette syndrome, but Lionel distills feelings that we've all had. Everybody has arguments with their own head. Everybody talks to themselves inside their head and everybody has versions of impulse control. Everybody feels at times isolated and misunderstood, lonely. And these are some of the core experiences of the human condition that I think what Jonathan captured is that Tourette syndrome becomes an amplified stand-in for the human emotions that we all feel. And I think it's why people are relating to Lionel, because I think that they actually can see themselves in him. It's not because he's exotic, but it's because he's human, and because the things that he's experiencing in the film, the challenge of navigating himself.
So it's pretty cool how close his words were to what we talk about here, about navigating TS, and about having that sense of empathy. And so a major motion picture attempting to depict Tourette syndrome, you know, all kinds of alarms go off with that, right? Just another bad story, just another completely flawed representation. Or do we learn that Ed Norton cared a bit more than that and actually wanted to present the public with a portrayal of TS that has an authentic feel to it? I mean, you just heard what he said about the movie and his approach to it. But anybody with TS and a sensitivity about the portrayal and how it comes off, anyone in that group knows this movie could have gone either way. And I guess I was really skeptical, you know, even as I was hearing good things about it. Well, after watching all 2.5 hours of it, I left with a pretty high opinion. Again, I was skeptical. You know, it's always a sensitive thing when a disability is portrayed by somebody who doesn't have that disability and really truly can't actually simulate the headspace of people who live with it every day, no matter how good of an actor you are. And sometimes, you know, even before we know whether that actor did a good job or not, that actor or that production company gets an earful from us, basically saying, you know, look, To make a real connection, you need somebody with direct lived experience of that disability or disorder to play the character and really portray it as it needs to be portrayed because, we've been burned so many times in the past by bad portrayals and bad information. I'm just kind of summarizing what sometimes does happen with these situations. But what I learned about Norton, though, and by the way, again, this was his movie. He adapted it from the book and he directed it and, of course, starred as well. But what I learned about him was that he was way ahead of us on talking with Tourette people, talking with the association. And I think the California chapter, too, just to make the effort to get it right. Like really working toward that, which would make sense because Norton had already put something like 20 years of thought into the Lethem book becoming a movie. So he wasn't going to take it lightly anyway, but he did give what I would say is a pretty adequate consideration to a better portrayal of TS. I mean, that's not what his ultimate mission was with this character. He wasn't making a movie about Tourette Syndrome, but his care for the whole thing overall meant that he wanted to be a human being about his representation of TS and the character that he was playing, Lionel. And really, I have no idea what a home run looks like with a Tourette portrayal, where everything's portrayed perfectly and fairly. And I don't know what that really even looks like, but I will say that Ed did a great job. He humanized TS. It's part of the dialogue. And really, what I think the best thing here is how TS is worked in as a kind of a social subject. This movie has great examples of interactions between him and someone else who has to make a judgment about his ticking. There are so many scenes where he's talking to somebody and his vocal tics are getting in the way, or he also has OCD and there's a lot of interplay there. And he just jumps in front of it like an authority. Like he explains himself. He has lines like, there's something wrong with my brain. I can't help it. I know the stuff I'm saying sounds funny, but I'm not trying to be. I'm really listening to you. He has lines like that. And it was like he took a role of reassurance and made it more palatable for the people he's talking to. And yeah, you can write a scene any way you want, but the effect of how he represents himself in the movie to other people is to make it so that people interacting with him don't have a question on their minds anymore. He's a regular guy. He just has these interesting tics that no one, not even he, can really explain. And the treatment he gets in return is, in some cases, somebody saying, something like, you don't have to be embarrassed about it. And I realized I said that in a cheesy way. I mean, this is not some like Walton's feel-good type movie. It's a 1950s New York sort of crime noir type movie. But putting those interactions into the movie, these positive interactions with someone who has TS and someone who has to kind of process that, putting that into the movie as examples to follow was a great reset on the portrayal, I think. And these very human interactions between Lionel, that's the Norton character, between him and other meaningful people in the movie. He just acquits himself and stays focused on what he needs to focus on, which of course in real life is not easy for everybody, but that's what makes him a standout character in the story. So it's more, for me about the person-to-person interaction in this movie and the humanity of his character. Like there are some funny moments and things like that, but there's nothing where Tourette is the joke or is left suffering in the end. And by the way, Touretters who saw this movie with me had lots to point out about the subtle authenticity and the good but kind of gritty vibe of the character Lionel. I actually recorded these testimonials on site for a project with the Tourette Association. This will be in a video that should be available pretty soon. And obviously I'll share that plentifully when the time comes. Also say my wife, Ambrose, really related to this movie. She also found a kind of a unique personal story to connect with in the character Laura, who has an interesting identity dynamic. And that's the same with my wife. I would say for me, the biggest highlight of the night in Los Angeles, beautiful weather, seeing Motherless Brooklyn with Ed Norton. The best thing about all that was, for me, just getting to meet with listeners of the podcast who, I really didn't expect it to go down the way it did. I was sure I would get to meet some of you guys, but man, it was just way more meaningful and butterfly-inducing than I expected. And I got to talk with Daisy and Jose. They were just awesome. We talked in the movie theater lobby and did some photos together. They were just super friendly and sweet. And sort of unlike my handling of David Lynch, I really hope that if any of you and I are ever in the same room together, that you'll say hi. Just please come up and say hi. I'm glad Jose did. I'm really glad I got to meet him and Daisy. I was actually kind of nervous out there because, again, I get nervous with travel that involves airplanes, and I get nervous with projects that involve, Ed Norton. That's a big deal, and you want to make sure that you're doing your best work, and you don't want anything to go wrong. And just so Jose coming up and saying hey, and then getting to meet Daisy and talk with them for a bit and take some photos, that helped me out so much. Just them saying hey and getting to learn about them, because I felt like I had friends there, people on the same team. And that made me feel great. That really took some pressure off. They had nice things to say about the podcast and just how they found it through, I think they said they found it through Google while looking for information about TS. And then getting to meet Jessica and Ingrid and Janine. You may know Janine from Scholastic Tourette Supporters. That's a really great nonprofit for Tourette scholarships. And I got to meet Janine, who was wonderful. Devin, and that was my biggest highlight, just meeting you guys and absolutely feeling empowered to do my job that night the best way I could. Motherless Brooklyn is in theaters now, in the US anyway, and I hope you like it if you go to see it. I think you should, just to experience something that makes more sense when it comes to Tourette. And of course we have movies, like Front of the Class, and there are others that sit pretty well too, but when it comes to a major motion picture with Ed Norton, it maybe could have gone bad, and for me, it didn't. I don't think it went bad. I think it went great. I don't know what a perfect portrayal looks like with something as dynamic as TS, but regardless, I'm really happy with the messaging here. It's in the right direction, and hopefully it comes off as a better starting point in terms of pop culture TS references, if you like. I do want to hear your thoughts. Not everybody is going to think like me on this. Not everybody's going to see themselves in the portrayal here, but boy, can I talk. I'll just go ahead and say, look out for more communications about TS and Motherless Brooklyn in theaters now. Go check it out and let me know your thoughts. More generally, it's a pretty fun, 1950s crime movie that gets into the whole Robert Moses versus Jane Jacobs story. If you're familiar with that story, it's kind of central to urbanism, saving neighborhoods and making a city for the people. Okay, so we're getting to the conversation this week. Real quick, big response to last week's conversation about photography as a way to connect with your environment or cut through the anxiety, or got a lot of submissions from photographers who have Tourette Syndrome, words and photos, and that's being cobbled into a post that'll be up on tourettespodcast.com pretty soon. So many people related to what Marco, who you might know as Mr. Move and Speak, what he talked about, just having the camera as a tool in the Tourette expression toolbox or art kit or camera bag, or no, it's too direct. I don't know. Photography and Tourette have a relationship for a lot of people, and it's going to be a really good post. I'll share that on social media too when that's ready. Right now, we got to get to our conversation this week with Andrew. He's from Toronto, Ontario. He's a dad in his 30s. And even though he has Tourette, anxiety, and everything else front and center, he's in a line of work that really kind of, I guess it either pairs perfectly or feels terrifying. He's a national sales manager for a big media company. And so he's constantly before clients and leads and at the front of meetings, big rooms, lots of people. The pressure to tick because of the pressure not to tick. Is this something Andrew worries about, or does he have a way of handling it? This is a cool episode. The whole thing feels good. And he has a great story about seeing another person who obviously had TS. Like, he identifies, like, this guy standing in front of me has TS. I should approach him. And then he does. And that's a great story. Lots more here too. This is me and Andrew.
My name's Andrew. I'm from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I'm 35. I'm married with 2 beautiful children. My son's 4 and my daughter's a year old.
And we hear this with Touretters. It's sometimes, you kind of end up looking at your children and kind of wondering if, even before they were born, you're probably having the question in your mind of, are they going to, inherit some piece of TS? Or, is that kind of thing on your mind?
Oh, yeah, no doubt. My wife and I had lengthy conversations for months prior to us planning to have children. And, I had always said, it's not really a fear of mine that if my kids end up having TS or if they don't, I just know what it was like growing up with it. And kids are brutal. It definitely creates a huge problem for you growing up, trying to everybody's trying to fit into their own and trying to find and identify with who they are and what they want to become. And it doesn't really help when you've got a giant flag above your head telling everybody, hey, look at me,
Yeah,
it is what it is. But, when we were talking about having kids and, taking that next step in our marriage to, start a family, it was always on the back of my mind. If my son or my daughter end up having it, that's okay, because it's shaped who I am today. It's a huge part of my life. My wife is extremely supportive, and I know if my one or both of them end up having it, then I know how to help them.
You just having that perspective would, but be invaluable to kids or other kids in your life too, that, you could relate to in that way.
No, and that's exactly it. You hit the nail on the head. Is you can immediately identify and relate to them and say, look, I know exactly what you're going through. I've been there. I've done that. I live with it every day. Like I'm here for you, man. Like I've got your back.
So what do you do for a living?
It's kind of funny. Like I got into the field that I'm in now. I'm in advertising and media. So I'm one of the national sales managers for a large privately held media company here in Toronto. So I head up a book of business within the company. And it's funny, like when you think of sales and being in front of a lot of people and having to present and, being in a room with, 15, 20 different heads looking at you with, it can definitely, spark up your tics a lot more than, even just the natural anxiety that people have presenting, or if you go back to grade school, having to, do a speech in front of your entire class. That was the biggest nightmare of everybody's life. And then you have Tourette's and ADHD and anxiety disorders. It just adds a level of I can't really, if you think about what the everyday average person goes through when they have to get up in front of a group of people, there's a level of anxiety that's there, that people get afraid or they're shy or whatever it is. But with us, it's magnified and 10 times fold, right? Like it's huge.
Yeah.
So to get over that at a younger age, I think I can kind of relate it back to playing hockey. You got a team in front of you. I was a goalie, so there's a lot of attention put on you. You're the last man standing. You're the last line of defense. You got to hold the rest of the game in for everybody else. And it's kind of like that now with my career. It's not a big thing anymore, but it's obviously a daily struggle. And there's certain things that I do to prepare myself for each day. I love routines. I think that would probably be a commonality with a lot of people. They like to have structure. They like to have a daily routine where they have a set schedule in the morning and what they do. And for me, sometimes I take the train. Sometimes I drive in my car. And for myself, being in the car for that hour and a half, I don't know how bad the traffic is for you every day, but living in Toronto and the GTA, you sit in traffic all day long. So it gives me a huge outlet to be able to be by myself for that time. I can turn the music on and I let it go.
We were chatting before we started recording about, I live outside of Raleigh, North Carolina, the capital city. And I used to live in Raleigh. It was just growing so fast that I was kind of looking at the rural areas outside that are, close enough, and, that you're not right downtown, but, you'll have a little bit of a commute, but you save on the money. And so we found a house out there, and I was telling people, it's like, I went from a 5-minute commute to like a 30 to 45-minute commute.
Yeah.
And everybody's kind of like, oh man, that sucks. I'm like, I don't really see it that way. It's like, it's kind of a nice buffer from, kind of getting out of the shower and getting dressed, and usually by that time I'm kind of tripping over myself because I've slept horribly the night before, but getting in the car and having that commute and that free space where, I can make all the noise I want, I can tick all I want, is a nice thing on the way into work. And I kind of feel good and I kind of feel released by the time I get there. And, I shouldn't be a coffee junkie, but I am. And, but I feel like it's just kind of paired up with morning coffee into kind of getting me primed for the day. And luckily my coworkers are cool enough to where, they're not worried about my ticking. They hear it all day, but they're not worried about it. Then I get in the, back in the car. The commute is a little bit longer getting home. It's maybe about 10 minutes longer.
Right.
But same thing, just kind of let it go on the way home. And it just feels fine by the time I get there. It's almost like the commute is almost I hate driving, I hate cars and all that, but it's kind of functional for me.
For sure it is. You have a bit of a time in the morning where you can get it all out of you and be relaxed. And, you can actually, it's funny because everybody decompresses when they go home, but you decompress going to the office and then you have your day. And then you decompress going home, and then you're calmer and you're more relaxed getting back to your house where you can start the rest of your evening and not really leave the office at the office, but you can let it go in the car, do your own thing, have your own time in your own safe environment. And then when you get back to your house, you're decompressed enough that you and your wife, and I don't know if you have any pets, but you go for a walk.
Yeah.
You go for a walk with your dog, or you go for a walk with your wife, and you do your thing.
Yeah, it's almost like fading in and out of it. It's like you kind of fade into your workday. You kind of fade in, instead of it being so abrupt. And I used to have that, where it's just, I lived, or I was, like a 5-minute walk from where I was working, and I get up. I think I mentally saw that as like, I can kind of stay up late a little bit. And, I can just shower real quick and get dressed and walk to work, and I'm fine.
Yeah.
But I mean, it being that abrupt and just throwing myself into the day like that, I definitely have a quality of life change with a longer commute. Funny enough, in a good way. But it kind of makes you think too about, kids with Tourette syndrome, and kind of, it's like you're going through the day, it's busy, you have your tasks and all that, and just how important that time to breathe is, or do whatever you want, and just, that being part of your structure is just kind of letting loose and kind of having that time where you can kind of fade in and out of things. And that's something I don't know if I had much when I was a kid. And again, I'm not a therapist or a doctor or anything like that, but it's kind of something to think about, I guess, knowing how beneficial it is to my adult life.
Oh, for sure it is. If I'm not taking the car, it's interesting. In Toronto and throughout the GTA, we've got a pretty extensive transit system with the trains. And if I'm not driving and I don't have a bunch of meetings throughout the day or the week, I'll take the train just because it's easier to get up and down. But there's two sections. There's the downstairs sections, which is, the loud zone where everybody can talk on their phone and commence with each other. And upstairs is the quiet zone during rush hour. So you can imagine the downstairs area. I'm not a huge fan of tight, busy, confined spaces that are packed with people. It's just, like your anxiety goes through the roof, your tics start flaring up a lot more. And it's a nightmare, right? Like it's unpleasant. You don't feel good. You start sweating and it's just bad. But then upstairs is quiet, but it's less busy. So it's the lesser of two evils. You're either quiet, holding, repressing, or you're downstairs letting it all out in a sardine can. And either way you look at it, it's going to test you.
So when you're in the boardroom with, 15 to 20 people, are you focused and kind of, we hear about people kind of focusing and knowing, like, I'm good at this. I can power through this. This is my thing.
Yeah.
I'm not worried about ticking, and I'm not going to tick. And then there's the other thing where it's just kind of like the process of that, or the nerves kind of bring it out. Does that, like when you were playing hockey and that kind of thing, I mean, did you kind of find yourself in those zones, or does it come out more in those times?
Yeah, no, 100%. It was funny. When I was younger playing hockey, the pre and post game would be, I'd be all over the place. My tics would be flaring up in the dressing room before the game. During warm up, they wouldn't be as bad. The second that puck dropped, though, nobody knew. And then I get back into the dressing room afterwards, and I'd have, some motor tics, some vocal tics, and I'd get them out. And then in the workplace now, going to the meetings or meeting with clients beforehand, if I'm in the car, it's my safe place that I can just let them out and do what I need to do. But the second I walk into that meeting, because I'm so familiar with the products and I know what I'm doing and I'm comfortable in my career and what I'm able to sell, nobody really knows. When we get into a casual conversation afterwards, once the business talk is done, then what, they might ask me. I might have a head nod or a blink or a neck flare, whatever it may be that day. They would ask, and it's funny, everybody knows somebody that has Tourette. But at the same time, it's like sometimes they're educated, but when they ask you, what do you have? I'm like, oh, I have TS. And they're like, oh, okay. And I think part of them sometimes hopes that I don't elaborate because they're not as educated as they want to be.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's nothing personal and it's not an offensive thing. It's totally fine. It's just...
Sure.
Maybe they're not comfortable understanding it and they don't want to know, or they do know a little bit, but they don't want to embarrass themselves by thinking that it's coprolalia and you just swear.
Yeah. It's an anxiety point for them, or like an awkwardness point or something. But I mean, I get that. I mean, that's happened to me a couple times, and I've just kind of let it go. I was like, well, you know, if I don't want to talk about it, that's fine, you know. But and I couldn't tell if, you know, the other thing is like should they not ask me about it, or but I think maybe they're just kind of in the situation, just kind of like, what is appropriate to say? What do I say? Like, do you curse, or like what's the first question that, you know, is appropriate to kind of get this thing going? And
they want to be as politically correct as possible, right?
Yeah, I mean, and it's like, I get it, I guess. Like, it's,
For sure.
it, you know, like, I can put myself in the shoes of somebody, you know, asking something about, you know, like a big part of your identity that I am completely ignorant about. I don't know the science behind it. I've heard about it, but, you know, like, I know enough to ask a stupid question. I don't want to do that. What do I do? And I don't know if that means that, you know, I should take I guess it's case by case, but, you know, like, if there's a way to kind of soften it for them to make it easier for them to ask a question, or if you have a story about it or something, like, you know, oh, just the other day, something happened with my TS, to kind of humanize it. Or I don't really know what the correct approach is in those kinds of situations.
I'm always of the mentality, it's like a stupid question is better than no question, because if there's an assumption, there's no question asked.
Totally.
Right? I'd be more offended if somebody just kind of brushed it off and just walked away, not really knowing about it. And then, you know, they ask you again another day, and it's like, well, I could have talked to you about this before, but you never said anything. So here we are.
But people generally seem pretty understanding around you on the job. Or,
my team's awesome. My colleagues from day one have been great. I was that guy who brought it up immediately and said, hey, if you guys noticed me, you know, twitching my head or making any noises with like a gasping or a clearing in my throat or a sniff, or if I'm talking to you, I'm a winking, this is what it is. And they were all cool with it. A lot of them, you know, like I said, had friends that have had it in the past that they've known, or a family member or a distant cousin, whatever. Yeah, it was some association, and that's great. And then it wasn't brought up. And then there's some new people that join the company, and then they ask, and then you end up learning that they've got a brother or a sister and they've grown up with it. So they know exactly what it's this super comfortable, safe environment. And I've never really had any anxiety towards going to work.
I'll say it's really, really important, I think, and meaningful if, you know, so that situation, someone told you like, oh yeah, I have a friend with TS, or I have a cousin with TS, or, you know, my little brother does. I think creating just that connection right there is really, really meaningful, because if you yourself have TS, you know, you may be pretty isolated. You may know nobody else who can relate to you in that way. Nobody else who has a tic disorder, TS, anything like that in your circle. But it's kind of neat how frequent it is that you meet, there's like 1 degree of separation, that you meet somebody and you explain yourself like, oh, I have Tourette Syndrome. And one of the first things they say is like, oh yeah, my brother-in-law, he has TS. Or it's kind of neat how tight knit the whole thing kind of is, because that's a pretty common thing. I mean, have you run into other people in your life with TS?
Well, that's what's interesting about this, is that I hear all these people telling me that they've met all these people and they know everybody who has it. But I've come across it's funny. Of all places, in the last decade, I ran into a guy about 6 months ago at a hockey rink. I was getting my skates sharpened, and he was the one time in the last decade that I've actually physically saw somebody, like, I could see somebody in front of me physically ticking, and I was like, I have to say hello, because
it's an occasion.
This is such a rare occurrence for me to see somebody who's doing this in front of me, that I have the opportunity to say hello. And I was like, hey man, like, how are you? I wanted to introduce myself, and I fully came out and said, hey, like, I've got TS as well. I noticed that you're ticking. I want to be, you know, as polite as possible. I wanted to say hi, because, and same thing, I said, it's been about a decade since I've ran into somebody who has it, and I just want to know how you're doing. And we talked for 45 minutes.
That's awesome.
It was wicked.
That is so cool. Well, I mean, did you guys find these like, bizarre things in common about
Everything.
your ticking, your experience? Yeah, I bet. I mean, it was probably a freight train of it.
It was crazy. Like, I was like, I see you do this. And he's like, oh yeah, no, like this is what changes here today. And then tomorrow it's going to be this one. And depending on the weather. And I was like, nope, no, I'm with you.
Yeah. You guys did your own episode of Tourette's podcast.
Well, it's the Step Brothers reference in the movie where he's like, do we just become best friends? It's pretty funny. It's like, that's what it was with this buddy. It's like, hey, do we just become best friends? Like,
have you kept up?
Only once in the last little while. He just got married, but that was sort of his life-changing moment in the last 6 months that happened. And I was happy for him and said, congratulations. We haven't really talked that much since, but it was just nice to connect with him and, have a couple of texts back and forth.
Yeah, that's a huge occasion. I mean, I still haven't, kind of done it out in the wild of, kind of seeing somebody who I think reliably, probably does. And they seem approachable. I think that's the other thing too. I mean, I don't want to, kind of like butt into anybody's life, but I do feel like just the connection of like, I know exactly, my tics are totally different. I know exactly what you're talking about there or what you're going through.
Well, even when my wife and I are out, we can see certain people out if we're at the grocery store or we're going to the mall or whatever. And if there's somebody walking by and you can see just the subtle little tics, you notice it before anybody else does because you have it. And then you kind of point it out and say, hey, look, I think she has TS as well, or he does. And then that's it. But that's not an environment or a place that I could go up to somebody and just say hi.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
It's a little bit intrusive to their privacy, but I get it. Like, I wouldn't really, it's not that I would care or if I would be offended if somebody came up because I got a complete different personality. But if somebody came up to me in the mall, I'd be, oh, hey, yeah, sure. But you never know what somebody else is thinking, right?
Yep. Totally. Well, I mean, speaking of which, so back in the day, so you're what? You're mid-30s, right?
Yeah, 35.
So back in the day, so this would kind of put, I guess, maybe some presence of TS in your life back in the late 80s or the early 90s. I mean, when did, and that being a time period where, the sort of, walking around knowledge of what TS is or what it actually is, was not quite as prevalent as it is now. When it was kind of coming on for you, do you remember what that was like? I mean, do you remember your early tics and so on?
Yeah, when I was about 7, I was diagnosed. My dad and my mom noticed that I was nodding my head and they weren't sure what it was. A couple of times they're like, stop, but it wasn't in a malicious way. It was more or less like, don't keep doing that. You're going to hurt yourself. I was like, can't help it. Can't do it. Can't stop. So they took me in to see the specialist and a full diagnosis about 2 days later came out and prescribed me with some medication. And the first time that I ever really knew that I had something, I cut the corner of my mouth on, it might even been something as simple as like a freezy. You know how the extra plastic kicks out the side?
I'm familiar with that cut. Yeah.
So that cut on the corner of my mouth. But what happened was my tick ended up stretching out my mouth where I cracked the skin. So it kept on happening and happening and happening. And that was the first time that I can actually remember, like, I'm like, okay, fully, I know I have something here. And
this is nuts. I mean, I feel like I had the exact same tick brought on by the exact same thing, like an otter pop or something like that. That really sharp plastic that, I mean, it's like a saw.
It's a razor blade.
Yeah. I mean, this may be I kind of have a feeling a lot of other people, like roughly our age, mid to late 30s, would relate to this too. Yeah. This is, anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's pretty specific.
Yeah, and that was the very first time that I can really remember saying to myself, okay, I definitely have something that's different than everybody else. It's not just me, aggravating this injury. It's something that I physically can't stop doing. And then fast forward about maybe 6 months later, I bit my tongue. I was riding my bike and, you're young and dumb doing tricks on your bike and you fall and crash your face and I bit my tongue. And what happened was I started grinding my 3 front teeth on the tip of my tongue to the point that I started making the tongue go raw. And it aggravated, it aggravated it so much that I had to go and get an antiseptic mouthwash to make sure that the infection wouldn't spread, because it was just grinding it so bad that it would be bleeding and raw, and it was just awful.
Oh my God.
So you can't stop, you can't help yourself from doing it. And you just keep, and that's your tick, right? And then whatever you have an injury, if you ever sprained your thumb or your finger, it was always fearful for me that I would start making that my new tick, like clenching my finger if I, sprained my wrist or did something that was, aggravating to that injury that just became my new tick. So sure, you clear knocking your head around, but if you got a sprained ankle and you start rolling your ankle around, that's going to create a bigger problem for you, right?
Wow. Have you sort of traced, certain problems in your life? Like, I mean, with me, I have lower back pain. That's not necessarily to the level of, I need to go get surgery or it's just this sort of low level pain, but it is related to this tick that I've had for, since childhood, where I'm kind of tensing the very base of my back, or kind of like tensing the base of my spine, I guess.
I did the same
it's
thing.
going to become something, I feel like it's going to become an injury for me. For
sure it is. I had a similar injury a little while back. I had 2 bulged discs on my lower 2 vertebrae. And after physio, and to the point that it was so bad that it was into my sciatic muscle, into my glute muscle, and it was all locked up and so pulled and sprained and whatever the damage was. I was in and out of physio for like 6 months, and it was a brutal time because it was when my son was first born. I couldn't really walk around a lot. It was hard sitting. The only comfort and position that I could be in would be lying down on my stomach. But what happened was, after I was able to be more mobile and I started, being active again, once the injury sort of subsided, I started clenching my back muscles up. So now, 4.5 years later, you've got constant pain in the lower back area, and it's because of the muscles constantly being clenched up, and you're trying to position them a certain way, but that becomes the tick.
Sometimes, you sense these ticks, and your kind of brain goes into overdrive, thinking of ways that you can manipulate it to make sure this tick is not doing the damage that it wants to do to you. Like certain teeth ticks that I've had, where I've had to just kind of think of ways to kind of divert it into something else. I mean, have you had any thoughts about that, or anything you've learned about that?
Well, when I was younger, thankfully it hasn't come back in a while, but I used to have such a violent motor tick with my head that I would shake it so far forward and so violently that I would get such bad migraines, to the point that I'd have to sit in a dark room. And I don't really know how to describe the feeling, but obviously there's fluid in your brain, but when it feels like you're sloshing your head around, and you're so dizzy and you get vertigo and you can't really focus on one thing properly because your head's so violently moving.
Yep.
In order to take away from that, I would clench my toes in my shoes if I was, walking around or driving or sitting at my desk, to the point that I ripped through the soles of the shoes down into the rubber soles, and then it would separate. So I went through 3 pairs of shoes in 6 months.
Wow.
From just pushing my toes down. And then your toes are so sore that you're getting blisters on the bottoms of your feet. So you're really like, what's up or down?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's just...
it's just a constant cycle of pain.
Yeah, moving from one money pit to another.
That's it,
God.
But I tell you, from that head ache to the trauma of knocking your head back that many times a day, and you think about it in the course of being awake for 12, 13 hours, how many times a day do you think you're knocking your head forwards and back?
Oh yeah I've tried to do math like that before, of just like, if I consider how many times I do this per minute, how many minutes are in a day. I mean, it's just, you can come up with some pretty startling numbers. And
they're staggering.
Yeah, and just kind of apply it to your future health and and what that picture is going to look like. How have you kind of negotiated this kind of thing? I mean, it's not going to be a clean outcome to where you're going to be, completely pain-free, injury-free all the time. But
no. It's much better now than it was when I was in my early teens. Grade school, it was different because it was a hard situation growing up where I was in the schools that I was in. And a lot of people at the time really just didn't understand what it was.
Yeah.
And bullies like to pick on the easy target. And, when you physically have something that everybody can see and hear, you're an easy target for those guys to come at you. And it was difficult. And I think when you're in that position, and for anybody who's listening that's younger, it's tough now, because when you're younger and trying to fit in with different groups and different people and just trying to discover who you are as a person, it's a lot harder for you to be able to figure out who you are when you have something like this happening, because every day is a constant battle for you.
Right.
And we all understand that. But when you get older, you become more structured. You have more organization. As an adult, your tics subside a lot because the hormone levels are a little bit more balanced out. And whether or not you're taking medication or not, it's going to be better for you. And I find that when you're around people and you have a support system around you with good people and a loving family, it's a lot easier and it's a lot more, I guess, structured for you. You get into that routine, like you said, with your wife. My wife and I, same thing, right? My kids, it's calm. I'm relaxed at home. And when you're at a workplace and you're able to be around a bunch of people that accept it and that you're comfortable with, it makes it easier for you as well.
Another thing comes to mind too, with, it's so vital to have that support system. But for, any kids listening who are going through that kind of thing where you're getting picked on at school or you're being bullied, I mean, those people are the ones who rise to the occasion of bullying people, because it doesn't take any imagination to bully somebody whose tics, whose, so-called flaws are just readily apparent. If you're taking out, you're ticking and you're rolling your eyes in a weird way, you're making funny faces, things like that. I mean, that stuff's obvious.
You're a giant billboard.
Yeah, it's obvious and it's out in the open. But subsequently, to anybody, it's if just you're walking downtown and you see this big sculpture, and the sculpture is like a red watering can or something. I mean, the most obvious thing to say would be to walk past and say, like, "Hey, it's this giant red watering can." I mean, it takes no imagination to say that. It's just something that you point out and absorb. People who use that negatively against people for just pointing out to them what they already know about themselves and what's readily apparent just takes so little imagination.
Well, at the end of the day, we all know that the ones who are the ones picking on everybody are the most insecure to begin with. And to relate it back to a perfect example of something like this, I had a grade 10 phys ed teacher, and we were in the weight room one day doing a lesson, and we were all gathered around the chalkboard, and he was going through the lesson. And that specific day was a tough one. I remember it being a difficult day for my tics, and I was making a gasping noise, and I had a couple of throat clearings, and I make like a hiccup noise where it's like a hiccup and a gasp at the same time. It kind of sounds like that.
Yeah.
Okay. It was loud one day, right? So the specific day, it was just everything was lined up for something to happen, and the teacher turns around and tells me to shut up. And I was like, well, I can't help it because I obviously have Tourette's. He goes, well, why don't you just leave the effing room? So there was an incident. I lashed out. I said a couple of things. I get sent to the office, and then I get suspended because I was, verbally assaulting the teacher. Okay. I quietly left, and here's what happened. So you hear about this, and this goes back to my other point about how these people are so insecure. I find out a decade later that this man is a severe alcoholic. So you can imagine, yeah, sure, he pointed the blame on me and, threw me out to the center of the class as the easiest scapegoat because I was the one that was creating a problem. But deep down, you could imagine what this guy was going through. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I get it. It's fine. But at the same time, it's like, this also has to be shed light to the other side of the coin. It's like, okay, well, for the grade 9 and 10 years, you knew that I was a student of yours, and this is put on my file that I have this.
Right.
And you still felt the need to embarrass me in front of the entire classroom where you know that I can't help it. None of the students reacted. They all know. They're like, oh, don't worry about it, man. Like, it's fine.
Yeah.
But even to this day, I hope that it's different now. But at the same time, it's 2019 and there still needs to be so much more awareness of this. And it's not there yet.
People are still getting kicked out of movie theaters and people are still getting, asked to leave. I mean, yeah, I'm so happy with where we are in terms of awareness right now compared to where, what it was like when, say, you and I were, 10, 11, 12, 13, because that's a really, really vulnerable age. But, there is so much that needs to be spread still. I love focusing on the positive and, here we are, this is great. We weren't here before, that kind of thing. But yeah, you're right. I mean, these instances are still happening in 2019. They will in 2022.
For sure they will. You mentioned movie theaters. Can you do movies?
I don't generally. So I love movies as an art form. Especially just, I guess, from my line of work too, just kind of being in production. Love movies as an art form. When it comes to sitting still for an hour or more, hour and a half, so there's that layer to it where I just get really, really squirmy. I think I'll start fidgeting with things. If sometimes I'm playing with an object or like one of my cameras is in my hands and I'm pushing the buttons, it's just, it all kind of snowballs into this thing. And then if it's in a setting where like, you got to be quiet, there's a really, like tense moment, there's no background music. It's kind of like the climax of the film or something that you're supposed to pay attention to. Sometimes my tics really behave well in theaters like that, but if it's the kind of thing where I think there's a pressure to, even if I'm not going to tic, just the pressure of that, like, you better not, that's kind of rough on me too.
Yeah, you think you're trying to pick your spot where it's going to be loud or there's an action scene, and then out of nowhere it's just silent. You let one go, and it's like, oh,
yeah, exactly. Sorry, y'all. Yeah, I mean, how do you do in situations like that? I mean, so I'll say the other thing too is like tight grocery stores and things like that. That kind of freaks me out more than anything. I think having those really dense environments where there's a lot of shuffling and ingress and egress and a lot of swirl, and movie theaters are a little bit of a step down from that just because you're kind of stationary. But
small cafes and coffee shops, I can't do that well. I'd prefer to just go through the drive-through at some other big box coffee shop. Just to be in my own spot. I've never been good with movie theaters. It's just, I can't do it. And I haven't been to a movie at the theater in probably 6 or 7 years. And I know that when my wife and my son go, they go together. I just won't go. I'll stay at home with my daughter, and then she's only a year old, so I've got a little bit of time before she asks me again. But with my son, like, my son doesn't even think twice about it, right? He's just like, okay, I'm going to go with my mom. It's fine.
Gotcha.
But I know when he gets a little bit older, he's going to be like, well, how come you can't go? And it's like, well, buddy, and then you got to have that conversation with, which is fine. But even now with him, like, I'm constantly looking at him just to see if there's any little hints here and there, if he has anything. Yeah. And he's still a little bit too young. He's only 4, but I know if it is going to come, it's going to come in the next year and a half. I'll be able to pick it off.
Sure. Yeah.
And then see if he has any of the tendencies that I had before, or if there's anything that's like a telltale sign that I noticed that maybe my wife won't pick up on.
Yeah. There are all kinds of little clues that you can notice that aren't just ticking, like just other behavioral things like sleeping patterns. I mean, what else do you kind of experience besides tics as a symptom of TS?
Oh, the anxiety, 100%.
Yeah,
all day long. It's just a matter of environment too. Like I said before, like knowing going into certain meetings, if I have a big presentation and there's going to be a room full of people, if it's a boardroom of 30 and I got to go in there, before I get in there, it's just an absolute disaster. But while I'm in there, I'm in that zone, I'm focused and I'm concentrated and I know what the product is that I'm talking to the people about. And I'm answering the question, so I'm distracted from it, or I'll divert it to a different tick that they can't see, like the foot clenching in my shoe.
Yeah.
Or I'll flex my leg or my back, or just if I'll have my hand on the table, I'll play with the pen. I've always got to have some little vice around too. I'm flipping a pen around at my desk in my hand, or I'm flipping a page, whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
Just to kind of divert it a little bit. But at the same time, it's like in that meeting, I'm fine. Afterwards, I let it all out in the car.
It's kind of interesting that you said too about, going through the drive-through and just kind of like, I mean, I do the same thing too. I find that that's just a better experience overall. I go through the drive-through, just hit the parking lot and, just kind of chill there for a second. I mean,
if you know it's going to be a bad day, you turn the music on really loud and roll the window down.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, treat your car as just like this little therapy pod or something.
And I've heard in other previous interviews that you've done that you're a huge fan of photography, and you found that photography's really helped you.
Yeah, absolutely. Just having a camera and that being the sense of purpose to be to kind of help navigate the environment that I'm not necessarily comfortable in is really, really, it's big for me. And just being able to kind of like literally reframe and kind of maybe have some sort of authority over the composition in front of you, to where you can make something pretty that may be chaotic, where you can make something that looks good out of something that may be chaotic and bothersome to you. Like, that's really powerful to me.
Do you think the analogy of looking at the lens and looking through something rather than somebody looking at you?
Yeah, totally. Because it's kind of a private thing, looking through a lens. I mean, this sounds kind of creepy, but
it's fine.
But what I mean is, so considering different focal lengths. So, for example, like 35 to 50 on a full frame camera, it's you might be kind of roughly what you're seeing with your eye. It's just there's a black box around it, and that's the picture that you're going to take. But then if you go to, like 85 millimeters, 135 millimeters, and you're increasing the kind of focal depth to where you can kind of change the beauty of what something looks like, and how deep and how rich it looks, and how blurry the background is behind the subject, and just things like that, to where like there is sort of there's this vision piece of it, this kind of dream world piece of it, because you are kind of creating and manipulating what's actually happening in front of you, but which again is really empowering. But absolutely, in terms of different lenses will bring out, I think, different features and different kinds of people, different levels of sharpness, different levels of, sometimes the colors will come in different ways. I mean, like it's a really, really direct metaphor that I definitely just openly think about.
That's really cool, man.
Yeah. I mean, do you have anything like that? So, I mean, is hockey something that you still keep up with, or do you have other hobbies or passions or anything like that?
Yeah, no, it's funny, my family, ever since day one, has been super supportive, and anything that I ever wanted to do, or any activity that I wanted to explore to try and help me not just cope, but just find a vice and find something that I could do that would, take my mind off of it, or focus my attention to something else in a productive way. Mm-hmm. So whether that have been sport, or any type of hobby that I wanted to do, they were always there. My dad and my two sisters and my brother. And it's funny, like we always had the commonality of the sport in our family. My brother is an incredible musician. I wish that I had that musical talent, but I just don't. But watching my brother play, it's incredible. And looking back at it now, it's like, I really wish I took up an instrument, but it's never too late. But at the same time, it's like, if I spent as much time playing hockey as I did, learning how to play the guitar, maybe it would have been different as an outlet, because playing hockey, it's a destination, right? Where you can pick up your guitar at your house and you can be in your own environment and you can just jam and do your own thing, right?
Right, yeah.
So you physically have to go out and do it to go play hockey, but you can stay at your house, play your guitar, make music, and, rewrite it, replay it, do whatever you need to do.
Yeah. And so that's the kind of thing when it's me in that situation, that is the kind of zone where I kind of just feel okay about everything. I don't know if I'm ticking more or less. I just feel okay about everything. And whereas I have really, really bad, ADD, and my focusing kind of, it almost asks for like, hey, I know you're focusing on this one thing, but can you focus on these other 3 things at once? They'll be really pretty and aesthetically pleasing and it'll be fine. But we just need you to focus on all these things at once. Like that's what my brain is telling me. Music and kind of putting something together and having that process is, I think, just kind of enough of a sort of like mesh of things that are kind of competing for attention and details and things like that, that I kind of feel satisfied, and I'm not really ticking like that. I mean, I think you mentioned something about like when you would play hockey or when you were the goalie, or, you would kind of go into those zones. Are there in your adult life, like throughout your workday? I mean, do you kind of have things like that you can kind of slip into, or, there's the drive and all that, but is there anything else out there that kind of helps you along?
Throughout the day, I'd like to just take about 10 or 15 minutes every couple hours and just go for a quick walk.
Yeah,
it doesn't have to be that far. It can be just around the building once.
Yeah.
It can be down the hall twice. I could put my headphones in and listen to some music. It's just to, get a stretch in, and then also just kind of clear my head, and then, reset, and then go back at it a bit.
Yeah, that's the perfect word, is reset. I mean, that's exactly the word that I use when I do exactly what you just described, which is, like as soon as I just close something out, or, like I've been working on this thing for the past hour and a half, it's done. I'm going to take a lap around the block, just let that be my thing.
Yeah. And like I said, my colleagues, and our senior vice president, who I directly report to, they're all extremely understanding, and it's a very supportive environment to be in. And I like every one of them. They're great.
That's so cool. That's so cool to kind of have that environment to where, I mean, it's not just like them being educated on TS. It's mostly, and I have to give a big shout out to my office mates, Jack and Ashley, because I mean, I think the best way to go about it is just not make a big deal of it. It's not like they don't have to ask me if I'm okay every 5 seconds, and they don't do that. It's just, and I understand the sort of sense of, sympathy or empathy or whatever the right word is, to where they would want to do that, but they don't. It's just let it not be a big deal is the biggest thing.
No, none of us want to have a pity party. We just want to make sure that it's addressed, but at the same time, just go at your own speed, right?
Find a comfortable mode.
Yeah, and it makes you more of a productive person too, right? Because when you're on edge all the time and you have a boss or an environment, it's not necessarily dysfunctional, but it could be a negative environment, and that really affects your day to day.
If you have TS, that can really, really affect your day to day. And and the thing too, I mean, not to sound all cheerleader about TS, but I mean, there are advantages, and there are senses of creativity and there is a sense of focus, and there is a sense of process, and just things where if TS is unlocked and kind of employed in this positive way, but it requires that sense of just a comfortable environment to where I know people aren't going to freak out about me. Like that's the kind of basis for that whole thing.
No, exactly. And I can imagine that if any of your listeners are right now, going through an interview process, or they're getting a new job and they're going to be starting soon, or they just started, that's the most critical time for TS too, because it's a brand new environment. And the biggest thing that I've found with myself, and then people that I've talked to that know somebody that has it, is they like to have everything structured to a point that change really does affect your tics. And when you're into a new environment, or you move homes, or your significant other is having a problem too, like anything that's not on a regular day-to-day schedule like you are used to in your routine, when that changes, your tics get worse. So if there's somebody that's starting a new job that's listening to this, I get it, because we all have to go through it, and it sucks because there's going to be 100 new faces staring at you, wondering, asking questions. You're thinking to yourself, and a lot of it's self-inflicted too, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. The self-consciousness is terrible.
And that's the biggest thing, is that not everybody might be staring at you thinking, what are you doing? But they are just, that's the new person.
Yeah. Yeah.
You just blow it way out of proportion.
Yeah, exactly. It's like
you build it up in your head.
Yeah, it's like you've given yourself a migraine and you're walking around with bloodshot eyes, because of some fear that, is legitimate, but largely kind of, blown up inside your mind. And, like these things happen, people have bad days at work, people have bad first impressions, and people with Tourette syndrome are, not infrequently on the bad end of that. But, but a lot of it, I mean, people are genuinely, I will say generally and genuinely pretty cool. And,
for sure.
And understanding, and the jerks that happen to be out there, I mean, I don't know what they got going on. But
yeah, good luck to them.
Yeah.
You're just ignorant, and that's it. And that's the biggest thing, right? Like you said, the people that we all work with and the closest friends that we have, everybody's understanding, cool about it, it's nonchalant. And it's funny, like, I know that they're being polite and nice, but my family members and our closest friends all say the same thing. Like, oh, I don't even notice it anymore. It's like, well, I do. Yeah, I notice it. I'm thankful that you're being polite and you're a good person, but you can't not notice it. Like, I know that everybody in the room just heard me make that noise. You can't tell me that nobody heard that. That is not a voice in my head.
Be right back. The Tourette Association of America has been around since 1972, and today is the premier nonprofit in the U.S. working for all people affected by Tourette and tic disorders. One of the ways that happens is through communications and awareness tools, which is one of the reasons why the Tourette Association is the primary sponsor of this podcast. They help me out a lot, and you can find tons of information on their website, tourette.org, TOURETTE.org. And I want to thank them for their support of Tourette's podcast.
Do you have any specific dietary things that you try and stick to help you? Or
I think I'm just not necessarily to help me directly related to TS, but I am sort of trying to make some very meaningful improvements in my diet. I mean, I'm not an unhealthy person, but at the same time, I don't eat, healthy every day. And I'm trying to get a little bit more consistent with that. And I'm thinking just sort of like the general, just basic benefits of being a healthier person, I'm hoping will, kind of translate into a better experience with my TS or my anxiety or whatever it is. And I'm not saying any of this stuff is directly linked, but just feeling better about myself ideally will help me with some of the negatives of TS. So
I definitely do think that diet's a huge thing. I mean, if you introduce alcohol or bad food into your system, the next day it's a disaster.
That's true. Yeah, I've definitely felt, like just on harsh days where I feel like I've punished myself, and I definitely, the tics will come up more. And I don't know if it's just the self-consciousness piece that is magnified because I feel like I'm like, oh God, why did I do this to myself? I look horrible. Yeah. I feel horrible, but I don't know.
It was a fun night though.
It's almost worth it.
No, I get it. I mean, I've got allergies to eggs, nuts, and gluten. And
okay.
A lot of my life growing up was figuring out what's bad, what's good, experimenting with different recipes on how to cook food properly without, other ingredients in it. And, it's fun now as an adult to cook.
Yeah.
But figuring out when everybody else is eating pizza and I'm eating some rice cake at some kid's birthday party because I can't eat anything, and the parents were worried about the liability factor of poisoning me. So it's like, here you go. Man. You miss out on those. But, as an adult, you love it because you're in great shape physically with your food and, eating healthy. And I've always been a huge believer that a routine is huge. Eating at the right time, eating this, the same type of food that you need to be putting in your body, sleeping at the same time if you can.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. I mean, because if one of those things kind of gets slipped out of place or is missing for a day, you kind of feel it. Like you notice it, especially if you have, you have an exercise routine or you run every day at 6 p.m. or what. I mean, when you skip for the day, it kind of feels like an impact, or like the void is very much there.
I don't know if it's the same for everybody else, but I can tell you from my own experience is that if I don't follow the same routine, my tics are bad the next day. And if I miss something throughout the day, if I eat at a certain time, that's different. Like if it's noon, I'll have my lunch. If it's 2:00, I know between 12 and 2, I'm going to start, my tics will get worse.
Yeah. Man.
So it's one thing that I've always noticed about myself is that if I get to that point, I know that it's going to be different that day, then I got to try and stick to that regiment.
It's like surfing ahead of the wave,
Exactly. I'd love to, let people that are younger, if they're, kids that have just been recently diagnosed or families that have kids that are going through it now, that it's a day-to-day thing. It's not a fix where you can just, assess it and figure it out and then go with it. It's going to evolve and it's going to change on a daily basis.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're currently on medication. Medication never worked for me. I had clonidine and Haldol.
Yeah, me too.
And just was a zombie.
Right.
And I didn't like the way I felt on it. So some kids are going to get put on meds. That's great. If it doesn't work, okay. If it does work, awesome. It's a struggle, but at the same time, I wouldn't change it for the world because it's made me who I am today.
I want to give you props for saying something that I don't think has really been said quite enough on the podcast about, if you're new to TS, kind of how do you regard this? I think it really is important to say that like this, don't approach it like this is something that we're gonna, look at it as something that, it's like that this is gonna be your roommate, and maybe it'll move out at some point, but it's here right now, and get to know it and learn, figure out how it works, because, it could be bad or it could be good, but it kind of accepting and kind of making the best of that situation on your terms. I'm really glad that you brought that up about just get used to it. It can be good, just get used to it though.
For sure it is. And you know what? Like you kind of look at it when you're younger as a bit of a downer and okay, I got this. Well, poor me. It's not about that, because when you have a support system that are with you every day, if you've got your core group of your friends, you've got your family members, a significant other, spouse, whatever that person may be, your partner, if you have that in your life, it makes it that much easier. We can't do it by ourselves and it would be awful, but if you have just a couple of people that that either they have it or you've got that type of security in your life where somebody that's going to be able to be there with you and they have your back, that's all you need. Because, like you said before, is that the people that are ignorant, well, there's just something wrong with them.
Thanks so much for listening, and thanks to Andrew for taking the time. And of course, I always want to know what you relate to in listening to this. The Tourette's Podcast discussion group on Facebook is a great place to take it, along with any questions, shout-outs, stories, reactions to anything you've heard here. Anything. And it's also the place where you can tell Sophia, the admin, thank you for all the help. Can't do the discussion group without her. And I guess part of that, Tourette's Podcast is getting busier and busier. More email, which I love. I read everything and respond however I can. Please keep that stuff coming, because it keeps me in the loop and clued in with you and what you're thinking about, and that's crucial. Never hesitate to share a thought with me. Tourette'sPodcast@gmail.com. Or just say hi or anything. You can also find me through Twitter @Tourette'sPod. But yeah, things are getting busier, and that's one reason why I'm grateful to the Tourette Association of America for all the help and support. They are the primary sponsor of this podcast, and they've been amazing to me in other ways too. They've actually got their annual gala coming right up, November 18th. The gala raises support for Tourette, and they're going to be honoring a familiar face, David Begnaud, the CBS News journalist who opened up publicly about having TS, and you heard him on this podcast as well. David Begnaud, he's the honoree. Keynote speech from Jumaine Williams, a former New York City councilman and current NYC public advocate, also a Touretteer. And Michael Wolff will be there, jazz pianist with TS. So that's November 18th. I know that's coming right up, but there's a whole calendar of future events at Tourette.org. Free webinars, there's one coming up December 5th called Sleep Difficulties and Tourette Syndrome. Again, that's a free webinar on a topic that affects a lot of us here. And if you look ahead to 2020 on the Tourette.org calendar, you'll see a link to information about the next annual conference, May 2020 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I just was for the Treating Tourette Together Summit this past summer. Minneapolis is a beautiful city, not to mention a really cool place for music. But yeah, May 2020, the next annual conference of the Tourette Association of America, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Tourette.org for info on that and tons more. Thanks to them for sponsoring this show, too. Really cool. If you want to support the podcast in a small but endlessly appreciated way, you can do so at patreon.com/Tourette's Podcast. Follow along on Instagram. Just look us up. And, of course, Tourette'sPodcast.com. Back with a new episode next week, and we'll be talking to you in the meantime. This is Ben.